Her fingers moved. Just barely. The heart monitor didn't change, the machines kept humming, but the young doctor froze with a strip of clean gauze in his hand as the woman who hadn't opened her eyes in 8 months tightened her grip around his wrist. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. And then her lips parted. Before we go any further, if stories about kindness and unexpected human connection mean something to you, make sure you're subscribed to Kindness Teles. Like this video and share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the smallest moments can change an entire life, and you never know who might need to hear this one. The woman in that hospital bed was known across Chicago as a titan of industry. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and for decades she had been the sharp mind behind Whitmore Biotech, a pharmaceutical company that had started in a cramped garage on the outskirts of the city and grown into a billion-dollar corporation. She had built it alongside her late husband, reinvesting every penny, working 14-hour days, and earning a reputation for being tough, decisive, and almost impossible to impress. To the public, she was a millionaire visionary. To the board of directors, she was the backbone of the company. But to the hospital staff on the 12th floor of St. Matthew's Medical Center, she was simply room 1217. A patient in a coma after a devastating car accident on Lakeshore Drive. 8 months earlier, her black sedan had been struck by a delivery truck that ran a red light. The impact left her with severe head trauma. Surgeons worked through the night to save her life. They succeeded, but she never woke up. At first, the hospital room was crowded with suits and hushed conversations. Lawyers reviewed documents. Executives debated leadership transitions in the hallway. Family members stood awkwardly at her bedside, unsure whether to speak to her or about her. But as weeks turned into months, the visits grew shorter. Then rarer. Eventually, the only consistent presence in that room was the steady rhythm of machines and the quiet footsteps of nurses. Enter Dr. Daniel Reyes. He was 29 years old, fresh out of his neurology residency, and assigned to St. Matthew's as part of a fellowship program. He didn't come from wealth or influence. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in Aurora, Illinois, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices at night so he could study during the day. He had watched her wrap bandages around her own blistered hands after long shifts and still smile at him over reheated leftovers. When Daniel was assigned to monitor Eleanor Whitmore's case, some of the senior doctors treated it like a routine obligation. The prognosis wasn't hopeful. Severe diffuse axonal injury. Minimal brain activity. Maintain stability, they said. Prevent infection. Wait. But Daniel didn't see a case file. He saw a human being. He noticed how carefully the nurses arranged her silver hair against the pillow. He saw the faint scar along her collarbone from a childhood surgery, the tiny freckles on her hands. He began talking to her during his rounds, not in the clinical tone he used for charts, but in the same steady voice he used when reassuring anxious patients. One evening, long after his shift had technically ended, he stood beside her bed changing the bandage on her arm where an 4-line had irritated her skin. He worked slowly, gently removing the adhesive tape, careful not to tug. The fluorescent lights cast a soft glow across the room. "I read about your company today," he said quietly as he cleaned the area. "You started it with 3 employees. That's impressive." There was no response. There never was. Still, he kept talking. "My mom always said if you build something, you build it with people, not just money. I guess you knew that." He replaced the gauze and secured it with fresh tape, smoothing it down with the side of his thumb. Then he paused. That was when her fingers twitched. At first, he thought it was a reflex. Coma patients sometimes exhibited involuntary movements. He leaned closer, watching her face. Her eyelids fluttered, almost imperceptibly. Then her hand tightened around his wrist with surprising strength. "Ms. Whitmore," he whispered, his heart racing. A tear rolled down her cheek. He pressed the call button for the nurse, his voice steady but urgent. Within minutes, the room filled with activity. Monitors were adjusted. Neurologists were paged. Someone ran additional tests. And then, as if emerging from a deep underwater silence, Eleanor Whitmore opened her eyes. They were cloudy at first, unfocused. But they were open. In the days that followed, the hospital buzzed with the news. The woman who had been written off as permanently unconscious had awakened. Specialists debated explanations. Some called it a delayed neurological recovery. Others simply called it a miracle. But Eleanor remembered one thing clearly. A voice. When she was strong enough to speak, her words came out raspy and slow. Daniel stood by her bedside as she struggled to form sentences. She looked at him, studying his face as if trying to place it in a half-remembered dream. "You talk a lot," she murmured. He laughed softly, relief flooding his chest. "I guess I do." "I heard you," she said, closing her eyes briefly. "About your mother." Daniel felt his throat tighten. For 8 months, he had spoken to her with no expectation of being heard. And yet, somewhere in the quiet space between consciousness and darkness, she had listened. As Eleanor began the long process of rehabilitation, Daniel continued to check on her. Physical therapy sessions left her exhausted. Speech therapy was frustrating. There were days she snapped at nurses out of sheer anger at her own weakness. A woman who had once commanded boardrooms now struggled to hold a cup without shaking. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling therapy session, she stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, her jaw clenched. "They replaced me," she said suddenly. Daniel pulled up a chair. "The board?" She nodded. "Interim CEO. Voted last month. They think I won't recover enough to return." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet ache. "You built something strong," Daniel replied carefully. "Strong things survive storms. But that doesn't mean they forget who built them." She studied him. "You're not impressed by money, are you?" He shrugged. "I'm impressed by people who work hard. My mom used to say kindness is the only wealth that doesn't disappear." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Most people stopped talking to me when I couldn't answer back." Daniel looked down at his hands. "You were still there." Recovery was slow, but steady. Weeks turned into months. Eleanor progressed from a wheelchair to a walker. Her speech grew clearer. Her mind sharpened. Reporters began waiting outside the hospital again, hoping for a glimpse. One morning, as she prepared for discharge, she asked Daniel to sit down. "I've been thinking," she said. "When I was gone, what did it cost the hospital to keep me here?" Daniel hesitated. "That's not something you need to worry about." "I do," she insisted gently. "Because I remember voices fading. Except yours. And the nurses. And I've seen how this place runs. Understaffed. Overworked." He couldn't deny it. St. Matthew's served a large low-income community on Chicago's South Side. Funding was always tight. Equipment was often outdated. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I built a company that develops advanced neurological treatments. But I never invested in the place that kept me alive." A week after her discharge, a press conference was held, not at corporate headquarters, but in the hospital lobby. Cameras flashed as Eleanor, thinner but standing tall, approached the podium with a cane at her side. She announced a multi-million-dollar endowment to St. Matthew's Medical Center to expand its neurology wing, upgrade equipment, and fund scholarships for young doctors from underprivileged backgrounds. And then she did something unexpected. She called Daniel to the stage. He looked stunned, his white coat slightly wrinkled from a long shift. The crowd murmured as she placed a hand on his arm. "This doctor spoke to me when I could not speak back," she said into the microphone. "He treated me like a person, not a prognosis. And because of that, I am standing here today." Daniel felt heat rise to his face. He hadn't sought recognition. He had only done what felt right. In the months that followed, the new Whitmore Neurological Center began construction. Scholarships were established in Daniel's mother's name after Eleanor met her and insisted on honoring the woman who had raised such a compassionate son. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in the hospital walls or the company's stock price. It was in Eleanor herself. She returned to Whitmore Biotech, but with a softer edge. She initiated employee wellness programs, expanded charitable outreach, and personally visited patients enrolled in clinical trials. The woman once known for her sharp negotiations became equally known for handwritten notes of encouragement. And Daniel? He continued his fellowship, eventually becoming a leading neurologist. Yet he never stopped talking to his patients, even the ones who couldn't answer. Because he knew now, beyond any medical journal or textbook, that sometimes people hear more than we think. Kindness doesn't always come with applause. Often, it happens in quiet rooms under fluorescent lights, in small gestures no one else sees. A changed bandage. A steady voice. A hand held just a little longer than necessary. Eleanor's recovery reminded an entire hospital that hope can linger even in silence. And Daniel's simple habit of speaking with compassion proved that treating someone like they matter can awaken more than just a body, it can awaken purpose, gratitude, and change. If this story moved you, think about the quiet rooms in your own life. The people who may feel unseen. A kind word, a few extra minutes, a little patience, it might be the voice that carries someone back to the surface. Share your own stories of unexpected kindness in the comments. Because when we speak with care, even in silence, someone might be listening.